Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Manufacturing PMI Report. I'm Dan Zeiger, Senior Writer and Editor for Inside Supply Management, which is Institute for Supply Management's member publication. Happy to have you with us as we break down the Manufacturing PMI for April. You can call it stability or you can call it a stalemate, depending on your perspective. But the Manufacturing PMI was 52.7% for a second month in a row. New orders ticked up, employment contracted further, and the prices index elevator went even higher, reaching its highest level in 4 years. And tariffs and the Middle East conflict remained headaches. There's a lot to talk about, so say hello to Susan Spence. She is the chair of the ISM Manufacturing Business Survey Committee. Before we get started, I'll note that both of us are just back from the ISM World Annual Conference in Denver, where Sue was part of a discussion panel of very smart people. They all had great insights on business and supply chains, and we wrote a story about it. We'll place the link in the chat, and you can read it at your leisure. But right now, our focus is on the April PMI data. So, Sue, before we get started on the questions, just share what stood out to you.
You know, what stood out to me, and thanks, Dan. Welcome, everybody. Sorry. I guess I'll use the word resilience. It's been getting thrown around a lot this week. To stay at 52.7, despite what's going on in the last 63 days, and to be the same as our March reading, though we are a few points under consensus of 53, was encouraging. We are starting to see some slip in important input areas and demand areas, but we're still holding at 52.7. Our new order index is only up slightly, but it's up. So I think we're continuing to see the optimism in our semi-forecast from December. Obviously, our most recent semi-forecast will be out imminently. So that was great. I was also not surprised to see the amount of tariff comments in the negative vein, obviously, because that's hurting folks. That's up to 47%. The Iran war, sorry if I said tariffs. Tariffs, on the other hand, those comments are way down to 18%. So I feel like our panelists are seeing some relief from either legal court rulings or perhaps in some cases finally passing through what they're going to pass through. The demand sentiment improved slightly to 1.6 from 1 to 1. It's 1.6 to 1. So that's good. The question is the incredible boost in high prices, which I know we're going to get into, as well as the employment stubbornly staying below 50 and eroding 2.5 more points since last month. At what point, if that goes on long enough, will it tilt our PMI from expansion back to contraction? That is my big worry. Backlog is going in the wrong direction. New export orders is going in the wrong direction, and imports are going in the wrong direction, although 2 out of 3 of those are still in expansion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's stipulate and let's be clear. 52.7% is expansion. And as you noted, resilient is a word that I've seen thrown around a lot today in the coverage of the PMI in the manufacturing sector. But I know when we last convened, we talked about some of the yellow flags, and I think it's safe to say you just elucidated on it. That hue has only gotten brighter in April. We'll flesh out some specific index readings over the course of our conversation. But yeah, you kind of touched on it, or you did touch on it, but yeah, kind of elaborate on that dynamic.
Sure. Well, let's start with prices, which continues to be the big story here. As we noted in our report, in 3 months, price index has risen over 25%, highest level since April of 2022. When I think about in the last 12 weeks, how long has the war been going on and how much is attributed to it? These price increases, the first 2 months of increase was a total of 19.2. I think our survey was out when the war started, so a little bit of an impact, but most of it was before that. And so if indeed tariff increases have been passed through, perhaps that's a good reason. And then it was just made so much worse by the price increases for the war. So my conclusion, or my hope, is that the war comes to a quick end and prices settle back down. And, back in February, when the Supreme Court ruled on IEEP tariffs, immediately the 15% 150-day tariffs went into place. Okay, so that's going to be over, and then what happens is the question. So we could see a little bit of relief if the war comes to a speedy conclusion, and hopefully whatever is going to replace IEEP maybe won't be worse than the 15% that's there, but we don't know, and not knowing is not a good thing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'll continue on the prices index because, as you said, it was the story of the day for sure. As you mentioned, up 25.6 percentage points in the last 3 months to 84.6%. That is the highest reading since April of 2022, when it was also 84.6%. 46 commodities were reported as up in price. And I mean, that's approaching COVID levels. And only one was listed as down. So natural gas, take a bow. But yeah, just, let's further discuss, let's camp there for a little while.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I think folks know, or maybe not, U.S. produces enough natural gas to supply itself. And at one point, we're a net exporter. I think that's still the case. So unlike oil at a global level, natural gas really is more regional. I also read a statistic that was interesting that 40%, I think it was 40% of the AI build out is powered by natural gas, something like that. So that's interesting because the data centers and the hyperscalers, that's driving some of the commodities. But if that's indeed the case, it could be good news. Now, natural gas prices staying low is not helping at the pump, and we are not oil independent. So it doesn't help, I think, the consumer today. But that's really the explanation on natural gas. It is the only one down in price. Last month, there were none down in price. And as you noticed, I'm glad you counted. I got, about halfway through, it's like, there's like 3 pages of this up in price. And some things we're seeing, I think, for the first time in a while, or maybe at all, nylon, nickel products, solvents, these are petroleum-based products, but there's some new things in there. And just about everybody is up. So again, how much and what percent can you attribute to war versus tariffs? Don't know. I think we'll find out, hopefully, with a quick end to the conflict in the Middle East, and then we'll maybe see some settling down. In any event, the customers need to get back to ordering. Yes, it's an expansion. Yes, it was up 0.5 point, but it's only a smidge, and it needs to be up, in my opinion, more than that to boost backlog and production back up, both which lost ground this month.
Yeah, we'll get to those demand indicators with our next question, but we'll stay with prices. One more question, because it's our comment of the month, and it comes from a respondent in chemical products. He or she wrote, "Revenues are very strong. However, price increases are similar to a few years ago with the supply chain crisis. All imports from China are up 15% to 25%, which is impossible for us to absorb or fully pass along. Our suppliers in China are telling us that oil is at an all-time high, which is putting huge challenges on their cost structures." I mean, in an earlier interview, you had mentioned Jerome Powell's press conference last week, the Federal Reserve Chair, kind of hinted that the floodgates could be opening on passing price increases from tariffs on to customers. I mean, are we seeing a little bit of that dynamic there?
I don't really know. I don't think there's a way to piece it apart, but it makes sense to me. The Supreme Court ruling was the end of February. So immediately the 150-day 15% tariffs from section, I think it's 232, went into effect. So perhaps the producers have decided, well, we can at least count on it being 15. So perhaps if they hadn't yet passed anything along because there was legal challenge to the tariffs, if they know at least that's going to happen, then why not pass that along? That is speculation on my part, but it makes sense to me.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get off that for a little bit and talk about demand. That's where a lot of the resilience that was mentioned in the coverage today is coming from. You mentioned it was a mixed bag. New orders index was actually up a tad at 54.1%. Backlog of orders was down month over month, but it did remain in expansion. Customers' inventories index was a too low status, down below 40%. And as we've discussed often here, that's considered good for future demand. New export orders contracted further. That was the mixed bag. So, discuss that menagerie of data points.
Sure. Despite the indexes not all being where we want, I want to start with the sentiment, which is better for demand being stronger or softening. So last month, for every comment on soft demand, there was a strong demand comment. This month, there's 1.6 panelists telling us that demand is improving versus one that's not. So that is encouraging, although it is down. It is down from the last couple of months, but it's up since last month. So that's pretty good. The new order expansion we talked about already, backlog losing some ground makes sense as orders go out the door. And if the front of the pipe isn't being filled filled at the level to make up for what's going out of the pipe with deliveries, which reduces the backlog, then that kind of makes sense as well. Hopefully that's a temporary where they're not all in sync with each other. Customer index at 39.1 is pretty low. I think of it as a trigger point. And so maybe in the next month or so, we see a little bit of a boost because, customers can't order too low. We did see some comments about customers wanting to get ahead of tariff increases or not many around getting ahead of commodity increases due to the war. I mean, the petroleum was pretty quick. And I think probably the food and beverage pretty quick as fertilizer prices went up. But then there's byproducts of petroleum industry. And Chair Powell also said at his press conference the other day, you really haven't started seeing what you're going to see on that. So if that war ends, maybe there's a month or two of lingering impacts. It's hard to fathom that the worst hasn't come yet, especially every week when you drive to the pump and you're seeing, in some cases, I know in my region of the world in Connecticut, doubling of prices. That's really hard to take.
Another index that always is going to get a lot of attention is the employment index. And you called it stubborn earlier in our broadcast here. The manufacturing employment index decreased again in April to 46.4%. Break it down a little bit. And I know you'll have some further stats to break it down, but among surveyed companies, 17.5% reported increasing staff. That's up from 14.2% the previous month. But also the share of companies reducing their headcounts also increased to 20.2%, up from 15%. Let's flesh that out a little bit.
I heard a term, low hire, low fire, which I think is a perfect term, and that might be an unusual place to be. It kind of makes sense. We had this month on our employment part of the survey, overall, 40% of respondents say they're hiring, 60% say they're reducing, right? So I thought the percent in reduction, so that's every positive comment had a 1.7, 1.7 panelists being negative, and that's worse than last month. So when I looked at the 60% that we're going to reduce, about 34% of those were layoffs, 43% attrition. So the layoff word I saw more this month, but I don't believe that's in anticipation of a big turn down or toward the cliff. Maybe more that, okay, we didn't hire a ton in 2025 because there was such uncertainty about tariff chaos. Just as we're coming out of that, now we have this other conflict in the Middle East that is, helping to drive prices even further. And so let's hang on there. I got asked a couple of times on different interviews this morning if I thought AI productivity was causing the muting down of employment. And my gut, informed by the last semi forecast in December, and we'll see what this new one says, is that probably isn't the case yet. Back in December, by my count, only 29% of the companies surveyed were doing something with AI, either building something externally or using a third-party product. 29% 32% were doing anything. And then I guess the rest were just piloting. I don't think the AI is moving that quickly through manufacturing to make up for the fact and maybe being the reason for not hiring. I think it's still some caution because of not knowing about input costs, even though we have some more certainty on tariffs, but then the new chaos of the war. So we'll see if that has improved greatly or if it's just about the same at the semi.
Yeah. We discussed last month, and you kind of alluded to it when you mentioned a respondent comment a couple questions ago. And it does remain the chatter that I'm hearing that companies are trying to stock up to avoid disruptions and get ahead of tariffs. But the inventories index was up, but remained in contraction at 49%. And we'll also note that the supplier deliveries index rose again and continued to indicate the slowest delivery performance since 2022. So, I mean, is this a matter, do you think, of companies trying to get stock up and get ahead on inventories, but they're just facing roadblocks because of lead times?
I think it's probably both are the case. The commodity is short in supply. We have some that have been there for a while, electrical components, electronic components, memory. We've been attributing that to the AI data built out, but you've got some new ones on there as well. So I don't know what percent of the rawest of the raw materials comes from the part of the world in conflict, but there's a knock-on effect for everybody. And so some things are short in supply and prices are up, like the AI related stuff. But some things are just short in supply. So the supplier deliveries heading up to almost 61 kind of made sense to me. When that choke point in the Middle East is gone, we'll see how much it settles down to. We'd love to get back to a time where supplier deliveries are up because everyone's so busy and everyone's thriving, but I'm not certain we could say that yet.
Yeah. Just a education point that we'll drop in about the supplier deliveries index from time to time. That is an inverse index. So if it's a reading above 50%, that means deliveries are slower. That could be, as Sue just said, because demand is high and the economy is humming. But, this month, it's probably more of a case of the disruptions that we've been talking about. Big picture, you said in an earlier interview, you were a bit concerned and you alluded earlier in our time together about the coming months, and that's not something you're pulling out of your head. That's based on the data that you're seeing. Some would argue that, given the current conditions around the globe, and especially compared to some of the turmoil in recent years, that you wouldn't expect to see the positive readings that we've been seeing as of late. And, some of them were a surprise to me. How do we just make sense of this, thinking about the big picture?
Yeah. Here's how I think about it. And I'd encourage the audience, if you have not gone and looked at Chairman Powell's press conference the other day, I would do it. It was really insightful and I thought rather calming. And so I'll repeat what some of what he had said. The customer is amazingly resilient. They're still spending money, right? Unemployment is largely where it was a few years ago. Even though our employment index is stubborn, it's below 50, it can't seem to break it. And it's been contracting for 31 months, right? That's almost 3 years. It's still, I think it's hanging at about 4.3, right? So those are good factors. The consumer sentiment index from University of Michigan, I think, hit its lowest point in the last published number, although they revised it upwards a little bit, but it's still pretty low. That makes sense when you're pulling up to the gas pump and you're seeing those kind of numbers. It's your weekly reminder, or more for some people. But we still have an overall expanding manufacturing economy, right? 47.9 is our break point, I believe. And we still have 4 months in a row, despite tariff chaos, despite war in the Middle East. We have relatively stable inflation, even though manufacturing is not adding jobs, low hire, right? But we're still in pretty good shape. And hopefully agreements will be made. Some will say cooler heads can prevail. And we know what's going on with the stock market, although I really don't want to get into that because sometimes it makes me scratch my head. But that is historic highs. Some will talk about the Mag 7. Some will talk about, 70% of the increases due to them and what happens when AI build out is done. But we're in a pretty good place now. We need the tariff situation to get even more defined than it already is. Need to know what we're going to deal with and then just get on with it. Pass along where we have to, take a hit where we have to, and then we need these prices at the consumer level and company level here, as we saw, to just settle on down. Some of these increases, I worry about capital expenditure. I'm really curious to see what our survey says, because I think there was a prediction of an increase in that. We'll see. I don't see companies spending a ton of money in this kind of environment, and we need them to, right?
Right. Well, yeah, this is a especially good month, I think. This is a question I regularly ask you, but I think it's a especially good month to ask it. And I'll refer once again to that link that we put in the chat. Sue and her colleagues on that panel had a lot of great advice for professionals of any level, right up to the CEO and executives. So check that out. But yeah, as it relates to the April PMI data, man, if I'm a CEO or an executive, what are some of the big takeaways I should have?
I guess I'll go back to something I talked about in the conference in Denver last week. Whether it's price shocks or war or tariffs, there's all sorts of risks in the supply chain. There always have been, and there's no substitute for good old risk management strategies, including deciding what do you worry about, which commodities, which categories. You're not going to be able to risk manage everything. You just can't. I don't care how smart you are, unless you have army of thousands of procurement professionals and risk specialists, you're not going to be able to do it. But figuring out where you're most vulnerable and shoring up to be a little more resilient in those categories. And then understanding in some cases, like maybe where we are now with pricing, no matter where you turn, you're going to take a hike, right, of some sort. But you don't want to have zero idea of where you need to dual source or triple source or go outside the country or come back inside the country. You got to really look at it category by category, commodity by commodity, and understand when the worst happens, how do you survive it? Because you won't avoid it, but you can survive it with really, really good planning. And it's never too late to do that, even if you start in crisis. I know one of the stories I talked about at FedEx is I got really smart, as my team did, about risk mitigation when we had a major refinery issue that could have shut us down with jet fuel. And when you don't have jet fuel as an aircraft carrier of cargo, you don't have a business. And we just figured it out because we were really close to the edge in those days, and we got way better at it. So I'm going to encourage people to do that work. That work doesn't go away.
Well, yeah, this is never a bad thing on a Friday, but I think we are going to wrap up here a couple minutes early. And, I can't speak for you, but I'm still kind of running on fumes after that long conference in Denver. So, but yeah, we'll wrap up. Anything that I didn't ask that, before we wrap up that you want to add or might be important to include this month?
Yeah, nothing comes to mind. I just say, to the professionals watching, hang in there. Crises aren't always fun, but it is a chance for you to demonstrate your brand and your intelligence and, kind of keep a calm head when everyone else is flipping out around you. And you can keep the calmest head by being informed and understanding where your vulnerabilities are. So I'm going to encourage that always.
Yeah. Well, I'm already looking forward to next month, when we break down the May data and, because of the dynamics that we've talked about and, the impact that it could have in the months ahead. I know that'll be a lot to talk about. So thanks a lot for joining us, Sue. Have a great weekend.
All right.
And thanks to you for joining us today. And in a little bit, you can go to ISM's website to read the roundup article that details a lot of what Sue and I have discussed here. And we will see you on Tuesday when the ISM Services PMI report for April is released. And we'll discuss those developments with Steve Miller. He's the chair of ISM Services Business Survey Committee. Also, mark your calendars for later this May when ISM releases its supply chain planning forecast for the manufacturing and services sectors. The report will detail recent performance and panelist sentiments for the rest of the year. That's the report that Sue was referring to throughout this call. And on a date to be determined, we'll get together with Sue and Steve for a LinkedIn live broadcast to break down that data. And if you want to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing or Services Business Survey panels that help compile data for the ISM PMI reports, visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. So for Sue Spence and the great people who helped us behind the scenes, they are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. My name is Dan Zeiger, and we'll see you on Tuesday.